The Kalb Report is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, inviting you to a conversation with journalist and biographer Walter Isaacson on the subjects of genius, leadership, and the future of American journalism. Walter Isaacson has done it all. He is now president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C., and a few other places too. He has run CNN, the cable news network. He's been editor of Time magazine, which he joined as a political reporter in 1978. He's also a best-selling biographer, most recently of Steve Jobs, but also of Albert Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, and Henry Kissinger. And if our sources are right, he's now working on another book that will chronicle the history of the digital age. Wow. Welcome, Walter Isaacson. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be
My
back
first
with
question is the obvious one. When do you sleep?
At night. I actually get a good night's sleep. I love working late at night, and so I kind of sleep late.
But do you
in
get
the
up very
morning.
early in the morning?
No, I don't do that. And it's important to marry somebody who has the opposite schedule. So Kathy goes to bed early in the evening, and she's the one who wakes up early.
Well, tell me, if you were to do a biography of Walter Isaacson,
Never. Never.
where would you start?
I'd start in New Orleans because I always think that a sense of place is important in a narrative. And for me, growing up in New Orleans was the most important formative, influence in my life. Partly because New Orleans is a very diverse place with a mix of creativity, but also because, as Walker Percy, one of the great New Orleans novelists, said, people in Louisiana either come out preachers or storytellers. And he gave me one piece of advice. He said, for God's sake, be a storyteller. The world's got far too many preachers. And so you end up wanting to tell stories, and I think that's helpful.
Would it be an admiring biography?
Of me? No, trust me, my biography doesn't need to be written. I'm like you, people who really love to observe interesting people.
Well, you're a biographer and you write about interesting and important people. And yet you are at this stage of your career doing a history of the digital age, which sounds slightly off-key because it's not initially, anyway, biographical.
Well,
so
I do
what am
want
I
to
missing
make
there?
it biographical, and I think you and I are old enough to remember the first book I did with Evan Thomas, which was The Wise Men, which was a joint biography of a group of people who were statesmen during the Cold War. I want to start with Ada Byron Lovelace, a truly wonderful person.
How far back does that take?
1840, Lord Byron's daughter.
I thought the digital age started 20 years ago.
No. It started when Ada Lovelace came up with the first computer algorithm, working on Charles Babbage's difference engine, which was the first sort of calculator. Obviously not digital, obviously not transistor, but done in the 1840s. She was Lord Byron's daughter, and I've always liked to connect sort of poetry and technology, which is what Steve Jobs did. Lord Byron's ex-wife, Lady Byron, was not particularly fond of Lord Byron at the time and insisted that the daughter be a mathematician and not a poet. So she became one of the best mathematicians of the 1840s. And I would like to start with her and show how creativity works even in a technology or digital setting, starting with her and going all the way through the people who invented the computer, the internet, the personal computer, all the way through social networks and mobile technology.
But are you saying that that really started in the middle of the 18th century?
Well, I think that the concept, we sometimes call it, the Lovelace concept of machines that can be universal, can do any sort of calculation or algorithm or program you give it. That's a really interesting concept. No, it actually starts mainly in World War II, when Alan Turing is trying to break the German Enigma Code at Bletchley Park in England, and likewise at the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and other places where they're creating computers during the wartime, and even at the University of Iowa, there's a great professor there. And coming out of World War II was the notion of needing a network, a communications network, and thus the Defense Department helps launch the internet.
So,
but I haven't written this book yet. So
no, but the history then of the digital age for you becomes a series of biographies, really, biographical sketches that take you up.
Interesting people. Yeah.
Interesting people.
I mean, you look at the guy who invented the transistor, in 1947, William Shockley, a crazed guy. Actually turns out to be rather racist. I mean, not a pleasant person. But he creates the transistor, which really is the dynamo for the digital age. And you want to sort of weave all these people together.
Steve Jobs, who was also not the most wonderful guy in the world, actually approached you to do his biography. And then you accepted, and you ended up doing 40 interviews, I'm told, with him in the course of doing that. But he was, during your research, a live subject. The book came out, he had already just died. So the question, is it easier for you to do subjects who are dead, like Franklin and Einstein, rather than live people?
Well, you and Bernie did Kissinger,
Yes.
and then I followed in your footsteps and did a book on Kissinger. And I don't know about you, but after I heard from Kissinger after the book, I said to myself, I'm not going to do anybody who's been alive for the last 200 years. And so I swore off of living people. But then when Steve approached me, at first I deferred. It was 2004. He gave me a call. I'd done Ben Franklin, was about to finish Einstein. He said, why don't you do me next? I'm thinking, okay, Ben Franklin, Einstein, you. And so I said, well, I'll wait 20 or 30 years until you retire. He did not tell me, even though he had just been diagnosed with cancer, that he had cancer. So it was when I found that out and when he kept transforming industries that I thought, this is a guy who has applied imagination and creativity in a way that has totally transformed all sorts of industries, starting with personal computer, but everything from movies to journalism, as you may have noticed, to phones, to the way we consume music, and even retail stores. And he was the creation myth of our time writ large. Somebody who had started something in his parents' garage with a friend from down the street and turns it into the most valuable company on earth.
So when you do something with someone who's alive, I imagine your research technique is primarily the interview.
Yeah, I spent, it was more than 40 interviews by the end. And Steve loved taking walks. That was his way of talking. And we would walk his old neighborhood where he grew up in sort of a tract home, or we would, walk around Palo Alto. But you're right, there is a problem with doing a living figure. I became extremely emotionally sort of compelled by this guy, even though, as you point out, he wasn't always the world's, he wasn't like you, the world's sweetest, nicest person. He could be rough at times. But I began to see, and I hope the narrative arc of the book shows this, that the roughness, his kind of petulance or impatience, was connected to his passion, and the passion for making perfect products. So the notion that he could be jerky at times, look, we've all known, there are thousands of people who've known who've been jerks, but none of them are like Steve Jobs. So I became so emotionally attached to him, and I thought he would be alive when the book came out. And I was thinking he was going to read it, and I was bracing myself for that. So it was very difficult, not only writing about somebody who was living, but somebody who was dying.
But it's an interesting point that you raised now, because you have run CNN, you've run Time, now Aspen. Supposing Jobs were working for you, and he was as irascible as you say, would you fire him?
No, he starts off at Atari, the video game company, and Nolan Bushnell, the founder, is there with a couple people. And he's irascible. He's also become a vegan at the apple orchard where he worked, hence the name of his future company. And he believed that as a vegan, you didn't have to shower or use deodorant, which was a mistaken theory. So they put him on the night shift. They decide this guy is really tough, barefoot, you know, kind of irascible, but he's a genius. And he has this friend, Wozniak, who keeps showing up. And in 4 days, they're able to take Pong, which you and I are old enough to remember, and turn it into Breakout, sort of a single-player game. And so, no, what you try to do is channel great genius, not sort of be afraid of the quirks of genius.
All four of your subjects were leaders in their field, and I'm interested when you talk about genius and link that to leadership, for example. What are the qualities of leadership? How do you spot it, or can you spot it at an early stage in someone's career? Yeah. Does it come up later through maturation? What are the ingredients of leadership?
Well, if there were a single ingredient, you know, you could just do a little formula and that would be it. If I look at Benjamin Franklin and you say, let's look at the founders, the greatest leadership team, you know, if you wanted to pick one, there were different types of qualities. You had to have really smart people like Jefferson and Madison. You had to have really passionate people of conviction like Samuel Adams and his cousin John Adams. You had to have men of great rectitude like a George Washington, and even a Ben Franklin, who can be the glue that holds them together, is very clever, imaginative, and brings people together. But if I had to pick one trait of great leadership, it would be the ability to inspire. I've just finished a piece I did for Harvard Business Review where people had been talking about how Steve Jobs could be, you know, kind of, you know, rough at times. And I said, yes, but that was connected with being inspiring. That's what made him the leader. People would walk through walls for Steve Jobs, and he created a management team around him that no matter how tough he was on a given day, they felt we want to keep marching into battle with him. They could have gone anywhere.
Is a genius always a leader?
No, no. Einstein was not a great leader. Einstein had, didn't have a school around him. I mean, other scientists of that time, whether it be Max Planck or you know, Poincaré or the other, you know, they all, even the great quantum theorists of the time, you know, Niels Bohr, for example, has a school of people that become part of it. So Einstein did not lead by gathering people and having followers. On the other hand, he was a very gentle, wonderful soul who could make science and his theories magical. So he inspired people without being a pure leader.
Was Jobs a genius?
Yeah, Jobs was a genius even more than he was smart. In other words, I'm not sure he was, I mean, you and I know a lot of smart people, right? And they don't usually amount to much. They're a dime a dozen. It's people who can make imaginative leaps that really amount to something. There's a quality of genius that I think is very intuition-driven. And Steve said that he went as a 17-year-old dropout from college to India to study Buddhism. And he said he learned from that trip the limits of Western rational thinking, you know, what you would call intelligence or something, and the importance of intuition, the ability to gather experiential wisdom and make imaginative leaps. If you look at the binary star system of the digital age, the two stars that orbit each other, it's Bill Gates, Steve Jobs. I think Bill Gates may be the smartest person I've ever seen in action. He can have 2 computer screens going, each with 7 windows, and process information in a really sharp analytic way. But he did not make the leaps of beauty, aesthetics, and the imagination that I think Steve Jobs did in some of the projects. And Steve would describe that simply in his favorite phrase, which is think different.
Tell me, how does a genius deal with the question of faith, of religion? Does he accept the concept of faith, or must he have proof in order to accept something?
Well, I actually end all 3 of the biographies with Ben Franklin's thinking about faith. He's very empirical. He's asked by Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale, whether he's accepted Jesus Christ as a savior. He said, I've thought about that a bit over my entire life. Now I'm about to find out, so I'm going to quit worrying about it. A very pragmatic man. Einstein actually had a deep faith, not in a personal God that you could pray to break the laws of physics for you, like to have the Redskins win or something, but a God who is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. He said that made him feel humbled and awed. As for Steve Jobs, he really did take seriously his Zen Buddhist training. And near the end of his life, I was sitting in his garden and asked him that question. And you know, he had just told me about his sense of design and simplicity had come from Zen, and why even on an iPod there's no on-off switch because you don't really need it, it'll power itself down. So I said, you know, do you believe in God still, or do you? He said, well, I like to think, based on my training, that there's something more than just what we see in this world, that something lives on after you're gone, that your experiential wisdom and all your knowledge somehow gets embodied into a higher spirit. And then he said, but sometimes I think maybe it's just like an on-off switch. You die and click, you're gone. So I took a deep breath and waited a second, and he smiled, that half smile he had, and said, that's why I never like to put on-off switches on Apple devices. But the answer to the question is I think every one of them, and probably most people like that, are always open. They're curious. They're questioning. They don't think it's...
Well, I'm trying to understand
not sure.
it. With respect to Einstein, he would examine the entire universe and be absolutely dazzled by the, as you described it, by the order of the universe, and then to imagine that that wasn't an accident. Somehow that order had to be created.
He said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is the fact that it's comprehensible, that we can understand, that it has an order. It didn't have to be that way.
No, but if it doesn't have to be that way, and you're searching for an explanation as to why there is an order, can you advance to the idea of saying there is a God who has made all of that possible?
Yeah, I'm not sure he would put it in terms of a personal God who's sort of a watchmaker at the very beginning who sets everything in motion.
Not necessarily personal, but an explanation that is larger than his capacity to deal with it scientifically.
Precisely. And that's exactly what he said, which is, you know, the greatest power is the mysterious. The notion that it was sort of like Spinoza's God, he said, which is, you know, a God whose spirit is manifest in all the beauty and awesome order of nature. He said, I feel humbled and awed by that, and that's my spirit of a cosmic religion. But he also didn't go around preaching one way or the other, you know, that there is a God who's this way. I think being a genius means you know the limits of your knowledge, and Einstein knew that the limits of our knowledge get up to that point where you don't quite understand the meaning and underlying nature of the universe.
And explain to us then Franklin's view of religion. He seemed more humanistic and...
Very pragmatic and practical. You know, he starts off believing in religion because he said it's good for us. Whether or not it's right or wrong, people are better if they believe in religion. But he was very tolerant about religion, which I think is the most important thing. I mean, during his lifetime, he donated to the building fund of each and every church that was built in Philadelphia. And at one point, they're building a new hall for itinerant preachers. If you go in Philadelphia, look at Independence Hall, you look to your left, there's that old building still called the New Hall. And he wrote the fundraising letter saying, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody to preach Islam to us and teach us about Muhammad, we should offer a pulpit and listen, for we might learn. And on his deathbed, he was the largest individual contributor to the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, the first synagogue built there. So when he dies, instead of his minister accompanying the casket to the grave, all 35 ministers, preachers, and priests of Philadelphia linked arms with the rabbi of the Jews and marched with him to the grave. So I think his view of religion is that it should have a social utility and be used to unite us rather than so often in the past 3,000 years used to divide us.
Walter, how did you come upon these three characters? Put Kissinger aside for a moment.
Well, I can't put Kissinger aside because what happens is...
You can never put Kissinger aside.
Nor would he want you to.
Do it.
Yeah, that's right. Marvin, I'm surprised you would even consider putting me aside.
You are not as good as Henry.
No.
Henry would never have allowed no.
When I did that book, I was struck by the realism, the realpolitik of his foreign policy and why it didn't quite mesh with American idealism. And I was looking for the roots, when I was writing the last chapter of the book, of realism in American foreign policy. And I stumbled across Ben Franklin, who is in Paris trying to get France in on their side in the revolution. Even back then, France was a bit of a handful. So they had sent old Dr. Franklin over. And he does this great balance of power game with the Bourbon Pact nations, France, Netherlands, Spain, explaining their interests vis-a-vis England, why they have to come in on this side of the war. And I was thinking, gee, people write about Ben Franklin as some doddering old dude flying a kite and writing, you know, penny saved is a penny earned. But this guy was a great diplomat. And I looked for biographies of him. There were great biographies of him, like Carl Van Doren's biography. But Van Doren was an English professor and writes about Franklin as a writer. So I wanted to do Franklin, you know, I wanted to do Kissinger. I mean, after Kissinger, I wanted to do Ben Franklin. After doing Franklin, once again, you're struck by something you didn't know. With Franklin is that he was a really good experimental scientist. That flying the kite thing, that was the most important experiment of the time, the single fluid theory of electricity, and that lightning is simply a spark, and he captures it, puts it in batteries, comes up with a name battery, all that. And he would have thought us Philistines if we didn't love science the way he did. Botany, electricity, physics. And I thought, in my generation, there's a divide between those who tend to love the humanities and those who love the sciences. And I wanted to celebrate the beauty and magic of science. And the best way to do that was through Einstein. So you have a reason when you write a biography.
And then to Jobs?
Well, I actually went off on a dead end at one point. I was starting to write after the hurricane on Louis Armstrong, because I'm from his neighborhood in New Orleans. And I wanted to show that ethnic diversity, that sort of the mix of people, and a culture that rubs elbows and sometimes bumps elbows, adds to creativity. This is where you get great jazz. This is where jazz is born because of this. But I couldn't quite decode Louis Armstrong. I had to give it up because I found out I knew everything about Louis Armstrong, everything he did every day of his life except for who he was. I didn't know.
What do you mean by that?
I didn't know what was behind the smile. I didn't know if he was happy. I didn't know if he liked white people. I mean, these are fundamental things that even though I knew, I could have written a biography telling you everything about him, but I couldn't crack the code. And sometimes you just have to give up on something. And at that time, too, Steve had already talked to me about doing it. I began to realize that he was indeed fighting cancer. He had taken a medical leave. I also thought that Steve was a good example of creativity in which you mix a sense of the humanities with a sense of science, technology, and business. And so I became interested in that book instead.
Explain to me also why somebody like Jobs, who, from everyone's testimony, was such an unpleasant man.
We wouldn't really that. I mean, he was totally charming, charismatic. He ends up, you have to look at how does it turn out. He turns out with a really loyal set of friends, a really loyal set of colleagues who've been with, had been with him for the past 20 years, starting when he came back, well, 15, when he came back to Apple in 1997 and even before. These people these friends could have said, hey, this guy's too much trouble, easily gotten a job at Hewlett-Packard or Microsoft, but they stay loyal to him because the sort of rough edges, you begin to find them charming and emotionally compelling, as I did. Likewise with his family. He would tell me, I'm not the world's greatest family man. But he had 4 loving children, a great, I mean, astonishingly great wife, a loving sister, Mona Simpson, the novelist. So you can't make the judgment that this guy wasn't all that likable when so many people liked him. So you have to say, okay, he had his rudenesses and rough edges, but what made him so compelling, so inspiring, so charismatic? And that's what the narrative of the book tries to do. Take a guy who can get kicked out of Apple the first time around because he's too much of a handful to deal with, but in the end become the greatest and most inspiring technology leader of our time.
But then is it possible that you were simply taken in by Jobs?
Yeah, and that's a problem with writing somebody alive. Jobs had around him what was known as the reality distortion field from Star Trek, which meant he could make you believe things that were impossible just by, I mean, he could make Woz believe he could do Breakout in 4 days. Woz said, that's impossible. So he said, don't be afraid, you can do it. And Woz did it. And, you know, make Corning Glass believe they can make the type of glass that is on your iPhone and iPad. He goes to Wendell Weeks, the CEO, and says, don't be afraid, you can make this type of glass. And they do. I think being around Steve, you know, there'll be other people who write about him who maybe have more of a distance. I think all of us, you know, you were in the bubble with Henry Kissinger shuttling the Middle East. So you write from that vantage. I come along, I was not on those shuttle missions. I have a bit more distance, and certainly other people come with more distance. There's a value to being up close and maybe being caught a little bit in that force field. And there's a value 10, 15 years later of, you know, being more objective.
Very good answer.
Thank you.
Now, I'd like to take just a moment now to remind our radio and television audiences that this is the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and I'm talking with Walter Isaacson, the journalist and biographer. Walter, two of your subjects, Franklin and Jobs, both had an enormous impact on American journalism. And Franklin, you know, helped develop printing press and, as you were saying before, startup newspapers. Jobs invented the very devices that most people in this room use to find out about the world, to find out news. So my question is, does the new technology, the web, the iPhones, iPads, all of that, do they help raise the quality of journalism?
Yes, in most but not all ways. One thing they do, and you and I were lucky we were in an age right before this, is they break the power of the gatekeepers. You worked for amongst the greatest of gatekeepers, including Walter Cronkite, who would tell us every evening that's the way it is.
Right. And most of the time, that was the way it is.
Correct, which is why it was okay. But a lot of the time, those of us at Time Magazine, CBS News, we were the gatekeepers. We got to decide what people, you know, what opinions they heard, et cetera. The glory of the digital age, the internet, your iPhones, your, you know, your ability to search news, all the apps you get on your iPad, is you have thousands of ways to get news. Some of them good, like if I'm worried about what's happening with Netanyahu's visit, I can go to Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post, not just, you know, the local papers. Also, if I'm worried about what's happening in the central city, Broadmoor of New Orleans, where, you know, my family's from, there's now 20 or 30 people doing their own blogs or whatever, and I know which ones are good and which ones not to trust. Obviously, there is a downside, to the destruction of the business model for many types of journalism, like daily newspapers have had, you know, their business model devastated by many things, including the end of classified ads, end of big department stores, but also the fact that you can get what you want online, you may not want to pay for a newspaper. I think that's a passing, you know, thing. We will figure out the next business model. We're already figuring it out. And I would say that even though we can be grumpy about bad bloggers, the notion that the supply and sources of information have expanded, you know, 10,000-fold is so good that it overwhelms the bad. Steve Jobs, you know, really understood too. For example, take music, which was, you know, it's not like journalism. It's not. Music was being destroyed in terms of the business by Napster and peer-to-peer file sharing. And Steve said, in order to make it work, we have to compete with the fact that on Napster, Kazaa, and any of the peer-to-peer sites, you get your music for free. So let's make it simple, elegant, easy, and trustworthy. And he comes up with iTunes and the iTunes Store, and originally at 99 cents, it's that easy. And it helps create a new future for the possibility of music in which it's not just the big labels that get to decide with their A&R people who's the next big band, but you know, you have a chance on iTunes or anywhere else to be a band. Likewise, with the iPad, one of the most amazing things about the iPad, besides its beautiful design and incredible software, is the notion of the app. Something he didn't think of right at first, in fact, had to be talked into it. which is everybody, from my daughter to, you know, anybody, can be working in a garage or in an apartment or a dorm room, creating a beautiful app that might do something kind of cool, might tell you what's really happening in the college quad or whatever it may be. And I think apps allow for enormous creativity and a pretty good business model because you can actually sell apps.
Now, I want to go back to the first part of your answer, which had to do with journalism.
Sorry.
You were saying, if I understood you right, that the good thing about the new technology is that it allows you to get to many different locations for information.
Yeah.
Fine, accepted. My question had to do with the quality of the journalism that you're getting. Has the new technology, in your judgment, improved the quality of the journalism that we're getting? Not that you can go to an Israeli newspaper and an Arab newspaper to find additional information, but is the information that you're getting better? Is it cleaner?
Is it more objective? Well, on the more objective, no, but sometimes that's an upside, which is people have passions in one way, people have passions the other,
right.
as opposed to everybody
Okay.
having to be part of,
Right.
you know,
Right.
what you would call a network news model of objectivity. In terms of reliability, surprisingly more reliable than you would think, just like Wikipedia surprises you as being astonishingly reliable, what you would think a crowdsourced encyclopedia would not be, but it is. Likewise,
But it could be awfully inaccurate in many ways as well.
I
mean, it's getting better.
I won't want to
Well, don't
debate
argue about
Wikipedia, but if I read something in the Britannica and Wikipedia these days, I might trust Wikipedia more. I mean,
Really?
in terms of its updating quality, especially since the Britannica is no longer printing, but that's a different issue. So I think one of the odd things about the past 25 years of the digital age was it got a little bit too much, in my mind, web-based, meaning it was based on websites in which everybody sort of put out information, as opposed to creating communities, which is the way the internet was before the advent of the web, which no student here will remember, but back in the days of bulletin board services and online and the well, people shared information and learned who to trust in communities of information. We're about to see that happening again. That's what social networks are, that's what Facebook is, and even on mobile technology, it tends to be based more on social networks rather than websites that are published. So I think there's a reliability that comes from social networking.
Okay. Steve Jobs, I can accept that he has changed journalism, but I'm still not hearing an answer that he's actually improved it.
It's hard. I mean, I go to about half the sites I go to on my iPad every morning are traditional. You know, I subscribe to the New York Times. I pay money so I can get every article. I do that with great magazines, from the New Yorker and the Atlantic to Time Magazine, my old place. But I also find there are new journalistic outlets that are just as reliable, such as Politico, that really couldn't have existed before the advent of even the iPad or the digital age. Secondly, I find that there are sources of information I get that are not pure journalism, but are people who are running blogs about the New Orleans Saints, you know, the football team I follow, or the rebirth of this neighborhood in New Orleans. And to me, that's a wealth and richness of journalism, which would be 100% great if it weren't undermining the traditional journalism, which I still think we need. And it's undermining it in terms of the business model, but that's really just a question of the, well, I guess the business model is a big question, but it doesn't automatically make journalism worse. It just makes the business model harder.
No, I don't mean making it worse. I'm trying to think of ways in which you're describing a new technological system that makes the product better. But I think I've milked that
Well,
enough.
real quickly, you know, we talked about this earlier, but crowdsourcing can be good or can be bad. And the fact that whether it's after a hurricane or in a big world event, you're getting a lot of people creating a crowdsourced pool of information, that is really cool. I mean, this is great. Yeah.
My friend Ted Koppel, probably your friend too, warned years ago that the technological tail, as he put it, has begun to wag the editorial dog. And do you see that danger now enveloping what might be called the endangered species of modern-day journalism?
I think that if you don't adopt, and I think there's some things that aren't great. I mean, I think, you know, every journalist in the world is tweeting every 12
Yes.
seconds. This is probably not adding to the wealth of knowledge as much as it's detracting from the amount of time you have. I also think that probably we've reached the tipping point where there are more people blogging than actually reading blogs. And so I do think these will, you know, fads will pass and MySpaces will disappear. But I think what Steve Jobs did with the iPad in particular is create a platform for the next wave where you can make not just some random blog, but a really beautiful product. And Steve was able to connect content, technology, software, and hardware. I think the iPad will transform journalism for the better. It'll transform textbooks for the better, same reason. Textbooks are a brain-dead industry, unlike our old industry of journalism, and it deserves to be disrupted. I think, you know, you'll have really bright people creating great ways, like Khan Academy, to learn algebra that are much better than the textbooks being approved by, you know, some school board somewhere.
I think you'll agree that the big question these days, taking all of that into account, is will people pay for the content? You alluded to this a moment ago. Steve Jobs said, quote, "I believe people are willing to pay for content." And reading your stuff, I get the impression that you essentially believe that as well. Correct. And what I want to know is where's the proof? Where's the beef?
Well, as I said, with songs, they used to be essentially free.
No, journalism.
Okay. So on journalism, the New York Times, to take what I think is the greatest, you know, serious journalism right now, for 15 years, it seemed, gave away the New York Times for free.
Right.
I was a subscriber to the Times. I paid quite a bit of money. It was like $100 and some odd dollars. I finally said, why do I have it delivered and pay for it now? Because I read it the night before on the web. So I quit getting home delivery of the Times. This was a really bad business model, I think, for the New York Times to say, you know, take paying subscribers and say, never mind, take it for free.
Okay.
Now the New York Times, both with its iPad apps and with its web product, is charging people. And it is doing it successfully. It's giving you some articles for free, but then making you subscribe. We're all, like blind men, sort of feeling our way to what's the light and how will it work.
Some new financial model.
I pay now for Time Magazine. I pay for, you know, so I also think that eventually we will have an easier payment system, and this is something that Steve would have, you know, Steve Jobs talked about, where instantly you can pay 99 cents or something. So it can be a spur-of-the-moment purchase to get this week's New Yorker or this week's Time Magazine. I think that will offer this, because people don't mind paying 99 cents. They mind the whole mental transaction cost of passwords and filling in your credit card and going through all that. But if it's click here for, you know, one click, 99 cents for this, you know, week's Time Magazine, I think people will do that. And we have evidence that they do it. I mean, that people do micro or small payments easily.
I'm fascinated by one thing about your career. Why did you leave Time, where you were editor of the magazine, and join CNN? And why 2 years later did you leave CNN to join Aspen? And I'm wondering whether you can keep a job.
Well, I was at Time for 1978 to 19...
Okay, so you kept a job at
2000,
Time.
yeah.
You're keeping a job at
years,
Aspen.
yeah.
But there were 2 years at
I will
CNN,
tell
which
you
seems
something you don't want to
aberrational.
hear.
What?
I didn't like television.
Why?
I didn't have a feel
Look
for
at
it.
those beautiful cameras.
I know. I like you on television. You have to have a feel for the products you create. I loved print. It's an old technology, but there are those of us who love it. I love the creation of beautiful magazine pages, or for that matter, a book, or even an e-book, which is basically print on a digital screen. And Time Inc., or Time Warner, which owned my magazine, after I had been there 30-some-odd years, said, why don't you go to CNN? And I thought, well, this will be great. I'll learn something new. But I wasn't great at it. I just didn't have the feel for what makes great television. And sometimes in life, you go on a detour and you say, you know, I will never be as great as your producer. You know, anybody. She worked at CNN. All these people knew television. It wasn't something I knew.
So why did you get into it at all?
You know, I actually resist. I mean, I don't want to get into the gory details, but I had, you know, been there for, 30-some-odd years and had resisted being moved to television. But the people at Time Warner said, oh, no, you really should do this. And I got talked into it.
What was it specifically then about television that you didn't like?
I love the journalism, and I love CNN and what it stood for, and I love CNN now and what it stands for, which is good, I think, objective journalism. It wasn't so much I didn't like, but I didn't have a feel for how it worked, how you put it together, how you created shows. And if you don't have a feel for something in your fingertips, it's hard work. And I would get up in the morning and Larry King would say, the president's speech is during my time slot, I should anchor it. And Anderson Cooper would say, no, I should. And Wolf Blitzer would say, no, I should. And I wouldn't know the right answer. Is it just that simple? I wasn't good.
Why then did you leave the world of journalism and enter what is probably called the think tank world?
I wanted to get engaged in public policy. I cared about the substance of it, and to be blunt about it, journalism at that period, with the rise of various cable TVs and the different types of shout shows and whatever, had gotten more and more away from the substance of policy, governance, world affairs, and more into whatever it was. And I wanted to move to the other extreme.
But you're not blaming television news for that, are you?
No, I think that there's...
Or are you?
I do think cable, the rise of cable television, nighttime talk shows, just like the rise of AM radio talk shows, has not been the most edifying advance in journalism in our lifetime.
Who's responsible for that?
I think when I was at CNN, and take Christiane Amanpour, who I love, who I really admired, and we'd spend a lot of time doing a really great piece, say even before the Iraq War, on women in Iraq and saying, and then, boom, something would happen like a car chase or an O.J. Simpson or whatever, and you could get much higher ratings by having very opinionated people giving some thoughts about O.J. Simpson than doing that interesting long-form journalism. Whose fault is that? I don't know, but it's sort of the system wasn't. But I now think there's a hunger for good reported journalism, whether it's in print or at CNN or for that matter the other cable networks. And so I do see it swinging back.
I hope so. Your friend Richard Stengel, another editor at Time, once said, quote, there are two Walters, one who goes to parties and one who stays home and writes all the time. And in the New York Times once referred to you as the consummate partygoer,
well,
the operator of all time. Are you, in fact, a big party?
Not anymore. I think those were the days before I was, happily married, had children, whatever.
No, because I'm thinking, if you were, when did you find the time to write these books?
I vaguely remember those days. Fondly, but vaguely. In fact, probably more fondly than you deserve, but yes.
Where's the leadership of journalism today?
It's a good question. I think there are good leaders in journalism at the great papers. I think what we're missing is the innovators in journalism that are really keeping a step ahead of the game. Leaders the way Steve Jobs was a leader in the technology field. And so you have, I think, great editors running the great newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, others. I think it's hard for them to be running great papers, but also saying, how do we reinvent this animal called journalism?
You mean at a time of this financial in-between world where we don't know quite what the new system is going to be, there is no time really to develop a leader? I think
the time, the resources, and whatever to totally innovate. This is why Steve Jobs was such, in my mind, a genius, which is whenever he had something vaguely successful going on, like the iPod, he said, let's cannibalize it because we have to figure out the next thing.
What do you
And he
mean
would take,
cannibal?
well, in other words, you take the iPod, it has 1,000 songs in your pocket, and he says, why don't we make a phone and put the songs on the phone? People say, well, that'll destroy the market for the iPod. He said, yeah, but we have to innovate. We always, because if we don't cannibalize ourselves, somebody else will eat us for lunch.
Well, to go back to my earlier question, to whom do we look these days for inspiration in the field of journalism? Who are the new Edward R. Murrows, for example?
I'm sorry. Every now and then you have to just say, I don't know, and I don't.
Whom do you look to for inspiration in the world of journalism?
I look to great writers who believe in reporting. And those are people I follow, often in the mainstream press, whether it's David Brooks and Tom Friedman and people like that, or even online, Jeff Goldberg at the Atlantic. I mean, I think the Atlantic Monthly is a great magazine. I think the New Yorker is astonishingly good as a magazine. I think Time Magazine and Newsweek now with Tina Brown are really good magazines. Obviously, as I said, I happen to be one of those 5% of the people whose fingertips love magazines as opposed to remote controls or whatever. But I read those magazines and I'm awed by the people who are not just sitting in their basements bloviating on a blog, but are out there, in the Middle East, in Tahrir Square, or for that matter, in Ames, Iowa, actually doing some reporting. And you can find that. You can find quality journalism, in cable, as I said, a lot of the CNN stuff I love. Obviously, I still think the network news are very, very good. I love the PBS NewsHour. I love the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine.
But that's an awful lot for you to look at and to read and have the time to run Aspen and to write all of these blockbuster bestsellers.
Trust me, if you're spending your time reading a good magazine or something, it's a more efficient transmission of information and ideas than getting it through, other means.
True enough. What is it? How do you work your day? I mean, you're running Aspen and you're writing bestsellers. How do you do both?
I get up late.
How do you do both?
Aspen's got a really good team, and I go there. I love having a day job, meaning I'm not one of these people who just wants to get up and write a book. I tend to consume information in the morning when I'm hazily drinking coffee, and I do it now on my iPad more than on paper, but I do get a couple of newspapers on paper, but I flip through, sometimes just lying around, my iPad going to the sites I like, and whether it's the ones we mentioned. Then there's a wonderful team at the Aspen Institute, and then at night I write books. I tend not to, as I say, watch TV.
So you're not doing the big party circuit?
No, I tend not to watch TV as much, as I said, or go to movies perhaps as much as I should. And I tend to try to write every night from 9 p.m., I'm not going to quite make it tonight, till about 1:30 or 2 a.m. So I get 4 hours of writing every night, and 2 a.m. is pretty late, but if you sleep until 8:30 or 9, it's not that bad.
So I know you do your writing then after your day job is over.
Yeah, there's nobody phoning me. There's nobody around. There's no reason to check my email if it's 1 a.m. and so I can write.
Right. Do you have a team of researchers to help you?
No, never have had.
You have never
used a researcher. Never known how to use a researcher. Meaning, do they go interview people for you? Well, then you miss it. Do they go searching the archives for you? Then you miss things. So I've never figured out why. Plus, the fun is the hunt. The hunt for that information. Why let somebody else have the fun?
Do you see yourself giving up that day job within the next couple of years and just devoting yourself to book writing?
No, I tend to actually like to have a day job, a place where you have interaction with people, where there's a coffee machine and where you have to. I love face-to-face meetings. This is something else Steve Jobs said that connected with me, which is, here's a guy in the digital age, and you would think you could do everything by email and whatever. He said, no. Creativity comes when real people actually get together face-to-face. And you got to ban PowerPoint presentations. They actually have to engage in a real discussion, not show slides. But he built the Pixar headquarters, and then building the new Apple headquarters, to have these huge atriums that you have to go to get to the bathroom even, so that by serendipity you run into a lot of people. And he ran a lot of freewheeling meetings where everybody challenged each other. I think that having face-to-face exchange of ideas with people is the most exciting thing you can do each day, which is why I like going into the Aspen Institute office each day.
But I've stopped by the Aspen Institute as much as I can, actually, and it's a wonderful place. And I'm thinking that it is a spearhead, really, for a discussion of public policy issues. And you said earlier in our interview that when you left journalism, you wanted to go into a world of public policy. Do you see yourself one day being a diplomat?
Nobody's asked.
No. Well, would you like that kind of life?
I don't know. I mean, you had the same issues yourself. There's many things, you know. One of the things about life is there's so many forks you could take, and you kind of wish that life was not a sequential chronology, but was a way you could explore many paths. There are many paths I didn't take that I would kind of be curious what they'd be like. There are many paths I would probably like to take, but there's a lot of, juggling, and we'll see what comes along.
Okay. There are many young people in this audience, as you can see, and I'll bet any number of them would like to be journalists. Mm-hmm. At this particular point in your own career, as you look back upon your career, all of the problems that we've been talking about here, would you heartily recommend a career in journalism to all of these young people?
Well, not if you want to make a living. Actually, I would. First of all, journalism has been, for centuries, and will remain for centuries, the most glorious, exciting, wonderful, and magical trade that you can be in. You get to, whatever interests you, you pursue, whatever your curiosity is piqued, you get to ask the questions, you get to write about it, you get to share information and gather information. This is awesome.
Somebody once told me you get a front row seat on history.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of a problem too, because you're sitting as an observer of history, not a maker of it. So you always know that as a journalist. And that's one of the, the in the arena quote of Teddy Roosevelt, which is, are you truly in the arena? I think as a journalist you can be in the arena. I think also it's a very exciting time to go into journalism now, because as I, watch people in college that are about to do it, there are so many new ways to do it. You can invent an app that will gather information in a certain way. You can create...
Who's going to pay you?
I think that in the first year after Steve Jobs opened the App Store on iTunes, I think, it's in my book, but I mean, $2 billion was paid out to people who made apps. An entire industry was born instantly, because you can click, and whether it's slinging Angry Birds or having, an app that tells you about the NFL football games coming up, people pay $2.99, $4.99, whatever it may be, and a lot of people do it, and that's a whole industry. And people coming out of college, like my daughter, are creating books that are apps, teaching apps, curricula, music apps, apps to create things, and journalism apps.
Give me an example of a journalism app.
I use Politico on the iPad, which is not a super sophisticated thing, but it means I can just click and things pop up. I can search. I have the archives. I know how to get what I want. I can get feeds of material. If I like Mike Allen's letter, it feeds in because of that. This is, and those are very reliable, very good journalists. Mike Allen out there on the trail, all the people doing Politico. That would be the app I hit first in the morning when I want journalism. Secondly, you can take a traditional app, like a Time Magazine has an app on the iPad, but it gives you a different form. It gives you deeper, richer, more, allows you to share information, what you're reading. So it gives you more functionality than the old newspaper does, even though it doesn't give you the wonderful feel of the
Quickly,
paper.
20 years from now, we're going to have newspapers to pick up and feel.
I think so. I think everything
only
will
got 15
stabilize.
seconds.
Okay, they'll stabilize. Paper is a great technology. Not everybody can use it, but if we had been getting all of our information on an iPad and a screen for the past 400 years, and the Gutenberg had come along and said, I can put it on paper and deliver it to your doorstep, and you can take it on the bus, in the backyard, in the bathtub, you'd say, wow, paper, that's a great technology. It will replace the internet.
Walter, I'm sorry to say that our time's up, but you've exhausted my knowledge of the new technology anyway. But I want first to thank our wonderful audience here and everywhere for their interest, for taking the time to tune in. I want to thank our guest, Walter Isaacson, for sharing his time with us and his optimistic insights into the new world in which we live. And for all of you who share my passion, anyway, for a free press as the bulwark of a free society, thank you, thank you, thank you. And that's it for now. I'm Marvin Kalb. And as Ed Murrow used to say, good night and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much.